Thank you, Selena. Really happy to be here. I'm Gary Mellon. I'm at the Hunter College School of Social Work, where I have been for a long time. And prior to just being a professor at the Hunter College School of Social Work, I ran the National Research Center for Foster Care and Permanency Planning for many years. But really happy to be here. And my own kind of connection to youth permanence has been a lifetime of being connected. I have worked in child welfare now for 45 years. And I've been a foster parent and I am an adoptive parent. And I'll be really honest also, I have really changed my mind a lot about youth permanence over the course of my career. In the beginning, I worked in residential care and really thought, well, that's really great. We do a great job with young people, but realizing that, young people need families and young people need connections that are lifelong and permanent really helped me to see from my own personal and professional experience how important it was that young people had connections. So we'll all share a bit of our journey, I think, as we're talking with folks today. And really happy to be here. And I'll let Bob and then Cisco and Nicole introduce themselves, and then we'll move on to talking about a range of topics, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers towards the end as well. So Bob, I'll kick it to you.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. Glad to be with the panel and with the audience here. Bob Friend, Director of the National Institute for Permanent Family Connectedness at Seneca Family of Agencies. Been at the National Institute for celebrating our 11th year this year. And before that, I was the director. I was the director of the California Permanency for Youth Project in California for about 3.5, and ultimately the organizations merged. I started out like Gary doing residential treatment work. As many of us, that was sort of our entry into the field back in the day, and thought, we do great stuff. And then one day, I was there about 2 years and taking on more and more responsibility, running the day shift, learning all kinds of stuff and feeling good about what we did for the most part. And then one day, a whole bunch of buses showed up and took those kids all over the state. Never saw them again. And so that's when it really hit me what permanency is and what it isn't. Because we called each other family. Oh, let's have a family meeting, and everyone would get together in a unit and on the floor. It's just like, no, that's not it. So ever since then, I've been on a path. It's taken different courses through public and private foster care work, but that was a seminal moment that really helped me understand what permanency was and wasn't. And so I'll pass it to Sixto.
Thank you so much for that. Hi, everyone. My name is Sixto Canto, and I'm the founder and CEO of Think of Us. And we are like an R&D lab for systems transformation. So we take on a series of different projects across the country that act as different proof points for a state or national level. When I think about permanency, I have to actually say the word love. And I say that because I think we have tried to define permanency and talk about it in so many different ways. But when we actually start to talk about love and true connection, it starts to solve so much, right? The idea of having a conversation about a placement and respite and all these other nuances and things that are systematic behavior, right? Behavior that we get from being part of a system, it changes. So I'll just start there. I'll just start the conversation by saying, when I think about permanency, it's about how we actually centering that true, authentic, deep connection, and it is forming love between a young person and the people in their life.
And I guess I'll jump in with the introduction. I'm Nicole Dobbins, and I work for a National Operating Foundation. I'm a partnership advisor, so I work largely at the national level, identifying gaps in the field and supporting sort of technical assistance to get behind those gaps and provide resources to the field. I work largely with birth parents now, and it's really aligned with my passion, and recognize that there's such a continuum of permanency that's needed for young people. And, formally before this role, I was the executive director of Voice for Adoption and did a lot of policy advocacy. And I think in that role, I just learned a lot about how the system silos permanency. And often, kind of got told by policymakers that if you support adoption, you don't support reunification. And if you know me, that's just not true of me. And if you know my story, that's not true of my story either. And so really just thinking about how we can talk about and learn about permanency on a much broader scale. I think, Sixto, you mentioned love, and Bob, you mentioned, learnings, and as well as you, Gary. And so like I found my way talking about older youth permanency based on my own experience of aging out. I, experienced family separation, foster care reentry, reunification, and then ultimately aging out. And I think what I've really learned is we need better solutions and the right folks coming to the table to care for our young people in foster care, because it's a longitudinal and it's a journey, and permanency is not stagnant, and it's not one thing or the other. And so I have lots to say about, what permanency is and how it should be defined and how we should be evolving in child welfare. And so I look forward to the panel, and so really happy to be here with you today.
Great. Well, thank you all. Great introductions. I just kind of in thinking about what we're going to talk about today, I kind of went back to my National Resource Center, which we now have a website, nccwe.org, which has our youth permanency toolkit on it. And I just wanted to look and see what we were defining as youth permanency back when we wrote that, which was a couple of years ago. And there's so many different definitions. And I think, like Bob, one of my own kind of wake up calls, well, two things, is I remember sitting in a lot of meetings with folks who are adoption folks talking about permanency, and they really kind of saw permanency as legal permanency through adoption. And I remember kind of cynically sitting at meetings and thinking, really, a lot of the kids I work with, I'm not so sure they wanted that. And I went back to the facility I worked in, which we had, young people living there. They were supervised apartments. And I said to them, just hypothetically, if we could guarantee that we could find you a family that would be with you forever, would you be open to that? And I was shocked when like half of them said, oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I'd love that. And I thought, wow, I was really wrong. I was really wrong about the need for connection. And then two other things happened is I have a daughter, Leslie, who was my foster daughter when she was a child, and always was connected to her, and she was part of my life. And she was speaking with me at a conference one time, and somebody asked her why Gary never adopted her, because we hadn't gone down that road. And she said, well, because Gary never wanted to adopt me. And I thought, that's not true. We had this conversation, and you said you didn't want to be adopted. She said, well, I changed my mind. And I thought that's a really important thing, is because over the course of the continuum of people's lives, they make changes about how they feel about being connected to people. So that I remember really hit me. And then lastly, just Facebook has been such an incredible tool for me for connecting with young people who I was connected to throughout the course of my work. And I see various connections that have been sustained through that social media platform, which is been highly criticized for lots of good reasons, but also has some really validity to it. So I guess what I would ask, as we're kind of throwing this out there, is, besides love and connection, which I love, Cisco, and I remember people saying in policy, well, love is not part of the policy, or not, love is not part of the law, but it needs to be. But besides that, what are kind of the ways in which you've all viewed permanence? There's legal permanence and relational permanence and cultural permanence, but what are some of the ways that you've all understood permanence from your either personal or professional experiences?
I can jump in a little bit. And first of all, Gary, I'm looking forward to the TikTok videos next for you, as you're expanding your social network presence. Not that I'm on it, but anyway,
Me neither.
I think some of the things that come to mind for me, and again, I like how the conversation around the evolution of the principles and the ideas really came to bear. I harken back to the beginning of the California Permanency for Youth project, which was started by Pat Reynolds in 2002 with help from the Stewart Foundation, Walter S. Johnson, and Zellerbach, and some others. And it arranged the first national permanency convening, and it brought together people from all over the country: Bob Lewis, Pat O'Brien, Marty Lewisell, a whole bunch of folks from all over, and started sort of an annual permanency convening, and a bunch of papers got developed as a result of that, and many of them expounded upon relational or emotional permanency. It was really one of the first times that work got categorized, and even some of it's still on our website, which is now familypermanency.org. We still have some of the old papers and the history from that work. But I remember that's when it really first, to me anyway, started to creep in. And I know the National Resource Center was, some of the people I mentioned also work with the National Resource Center and help, kind of further that piece. And I think one of the things that we really tried to do was to go, when we're mentioning permanency, to have that broaden beyond that traditional legal sense that was identified and that you referenced a little bit earlier, Gary. The legal stuff is even though it seems relatively straightforward, it's odd that it's much harder to track and understand than people think. For instance, if a young person comes in to care at 16 and their family's rights aren't terminated and they exit without a legal plan, they still have legal permanency. The juvenile court didn't assign legal permanency, but their permanency was never removed if the family's rights weren't terminated. So everything's restored upon dismissal. So they still have legal permanency, although the way I think the system checks it, it's not necessarily believed that they do. If somebody's adopted and the adoption is dissolved post adulthood, then there's not legal permanency. If the adoption is just disrupted at the age of 18, then the legal permanency is there, but there's no emotional permanency. There's no love that Sixto talked about, or at least present in the person's life. People may love each other from afar, but it's not felt. And so, the whole path is I think is fraught with confusion. And for me, what's become clear are two things. I'll wrap up with this. One is that I really believe that the path to legal permanency is via relational and emotional permanency, and the way those things last is because there's the evidence of relationship, trust, love, and commitment that yields ultimately a successful sort of legal permanent outcome. And historically, we have sought more to, from a timeline perspective, get the legal permanency in place, whether or not the relationship's developed. And I think that's a mistake. And secondly, that I think it's the research is really evolving into helping us understand it's not just about a forever family or a particular person, that it's really about a network. And again, from a justice perspective, the more you can get the network to help decide what's best with the young person, rather than having a social worker in the background determine what a plan is. The evidence is that the collaborative practice is much better than the isolated social work or insulated social work practice. And that who are the people that are experts in a young person's life, let's get them to the table. And that's not the psychiatrist and the psychologist and it's like they can be present, but the experts are the people that have spent hundreds or thousands of hours with that family and with that young person, not somebody that spent 45 minutes 3 times. And so how do we make sure that the people who are most important to the young person are there for free and forever, long after any sort of government intervention is present? And to me, that's what permanency is. Like I'm really pushing harder and harder against just let's identify one person. Oh, they belong to one person. Good. That's better than none. But that, to me, that's not permanency. So and to us, to my organization. So I'll pass it to whoever wants to take a swing.
I'll jump in. Thanks, Bob, for that. And I think what I'll share is it really builds on that. I think we've talked about 2 things, right? The legal permanency and relational permanency. And the federal government has really tried to prescribe relationships in federal law. And we're human. You can't legislate relationships. However, you can, provide some guiding principles. And permanency can kind of be considered in these 2 dimensions that interplay that we've talked about, legal and relational. And it truly is possible to have both. And it's also possible to have one or the other, unfortunately. And we should strive for both always. And kind of here's why. Under the law, legal permanency is the North Star in child welfare.
Right.
Permanency includes, first and foremost, reunification, placement with a relative, adoption or guardianship. And, some youth may be legally adopted and still not feel a sense of permanent belonging in a family. And again, like under the law, lots of times and at the agency, this could be considered a successful permanency outcome, even though subjectively the youth may not feel that sense of permanency at all. And then on the other side, youth may experience enduring and permanent connections with adults, though these relationships may not be validated by a court. And this is why, to me, I think we must strive for both and ultimately ensure that youth have several anchors. It is possible to have relational permanency with more than one adult and more than one family. And I'll say that again. It's possible to have relational permanency with more than one adult and with more than one family. And for young people, the stronger their relational permanence is, the stronger they are in their identity, the stronger they are in their relationships, with people that care about them. And it might not be visible at every turn, but it is true over time. And in my opinion, multiple strong relationships with caring adults builds greater sense of belonging and a trajectory of success. And like I said, we're humans. Teens have the ability to love more than one person at a time. And in foster care and adoption, I think we tend to limit that. And I find it's out of fear. It can be out of fear of rejection by the parents that are caring for them. So a foster parent, it's fear that gets in the way of young people. And it unfortunately manifests to all of the things we see: loss, anger, sometimes even disruption. And so this is why it's really critically important not to cut ties for young people to their siblings, to their biological parents, to their extended family members and their community. It's so important. And relational permanency is a critical factor that the law doesn't touch, but we know is ever present and always evolving.
I want to build on pieces of that. And I think that one of the things that sometimes we miss when we talk about permanency is that by the very nature of some of the experiences that we have while in care, that we are creating this system-induced level of trauma that makes it harder to build those type of connections. Right. So some of it is actually very just structural. You cannot call someone, you cannot do these things. Right. Some of it is that we're wiring people in a way where you are literally telling them, oh, I love you, I care about you, right? But then your stuff is in a trash bag and you're on to the next place. And so when that becomes repetitive, you start to wire a bit you start to create the need for someone to build the right appropriate defenses to be able to go ahead and protect their emotional well-being, right? Our emotional well-being. And so I have to say, take that into the context of, and in spite of all of that, we still see how young people have built authentic, true, right, resilient relationships. Right. And so when you talk about resiliency, the resiliency to actually witness and get to know in a very intimate way the disappointment that comes from being connected, by being told your family, by being told that you're loved, but then that not happening, and then having the bravery to actually love and care again, that is where we need to start creating a system that would allow for the reduction of those negative experiences, but then promoting how Nicole put it so best, which is how young people are able to actually love and connect with not just one adult, as right, we like to push in the system, but the multiple people, right? And not just new people, but people who were in our lives before the system engaged with us.
Great. I'm thinking as you're all talking, one of the things that I remember hearing a lot from caseworkers when I would work more directly with caseworkers is, well, we talk to the young person about permanency and they really don't want permanency. Yeah. And I've done this training, I haven't done it in a while, but just unpacking the know of permanency. So what about that? What about young people who say, no, I really don't want that? What's your thinking about the kinds of things that maybe we need to reframe with young people, and this concept of of engaging young people, nothing about us without us. I mean, that's such a key factor, but you know, sometimes it's just double speak, right? You know, people have meetings and young people aren't even there. People make a plan and the young people's not even part of the plan. So I guess I'm asking two things: unpacking the no, and also what about engaging young people actively and realistically and authentically in their own planning?
So I'll kick this one off by saying, it's so funny because when folks are like, you know, do you want permanency? Um, the whole construct is all messed up. There is a power dynamic even in this conversation, which is for some reason we as like folks in the system, we as people who are providing interventions, think that we can give someone permanency
Right.
by helping them find someone. The reality is that we conducted 200 interviews in one of our studies talking to young people about the support of adults in their life. They don't trust you. So that no is saying, I don't trust you to actually tell you who my true permanency is, who my true adults are. The young people that we were in this study, we were able to talk to actually had supportive adults, but they were not willing to expose them to the system for a variety of different reasons. What was going to be that adult's experience? What would you say to this adult? Would you say something that would make this adult in my life think differently about me? So there are people there. And then the conditions that young people live in the system is that because that young person goes to a paid person, a social worker, an independent living coordinator, a CASA, a lawyer, when stuff hits the fan, the practice that you're getting as a teenager is to go to the paid professionals. And you rely on that, and that becomes wired. And so you don't get enough practice actually going to your support, the other supportive adults in your life, and you haven't actually built a dynamic where when stuff hit the fan, maybe you do go to them and try to troubleshoot. Maybe you do say, let's do this resume. I keep getting denied on interview. Oh, no. If you're in foster care, you go to your IOP worker, you go to your social worker, you get referred to a program. And so the actual structure of the system is creating your developmental opportunities to connect with people with paid professionals. And I think that's part of the fundamental flaw, because if you weren't engaged in the system, these specific milestones and these life skills and these developmental opportunities to connect would naturally be happening as a result of you being in connection with your teachers, mentors, and people in your life.
Great. Let me ask you, Cisco, did the study that you mentioned, has that been written up? Is it available?
Yeah, I'll drop it in the chat right now. It's called Aged Out.
Great, thank you.
I want to build on that, Gary, and just say, you know, everything that Sixto said is spot on. And honestly, you know, a lot of times we throw this word around, permanency, and it's such a made up word. You know, like it's a system word, and we don't break that down. And if we do, sometimes we limit that to adoption. We don't talk about the underpinnings of what permanency is. And we don't talk about what those relationships are. I will be honest, one of the first times I learned about permanency and truly what understood it was through an internship I did with Foster Club, and understanding, you know, wow, permanency is, yeah, having someone walk me down the aisle. Like who is that person? And does it need to be one person? And really talking to young people about what relationships are and what they look like, not in this moment, but longitudinally. I think that's where we often get it wrong too, is we are constantly focusing on the moment, because the problem is the system is focusing on a placement as permanency,
right,
and not a relationship in the longitudinal or the long-term outcomes when we establish those meaningful relationships. So it's really breaking it down, getting to what they want. And honestly, the reasons they say no often is because you didn't listen to them in the first place. You know, you didn't follow through on what they wanted. Oftentimes they do want to go back home. What does that look like? Why don't we have more transparency, or why can't we? What are the fears that we have and hold in place about being transparent about what that is, but also maintaining those relationships in the absence of the legal permanency with the parent, if that cannot happen. And I have so much more to say on that, and I'll hold it for later in the conversation, but I have tons to say on the reasons we need to be more healing in our practice, in inclusion of those relationships with families. I think that, again, we talk about what's in law. We've governed, the connections to siblings. But quite frankly, even if you go to the path of adoption and you have a TPR, which is termination of parental rights, unfortunately, you're terminating in so many instances the rest of that child's family. And it may not mean a lot in the moment, and it may at the moment, but over the time, you lose all of those connections. And quite frankly, if looking back, if you don't care about who I care about, then you've lost my trust. And that means I feel how I perceive that is you don't care about me. If you don't care about where I came from and who I was connected to before I got in this place, I come with a history. So automatically, if you're going to be thinking about me in a placement or even further down the road of what guardianship or adoption looks like, if you don't care about where I came from, then you're ignoring everything about who I am. And honestly, we can't think about young people in foster care, even if it gets to the point of adoption, as not considering that child as a blended family. You just can't. They don't come from absence. So I think we need to really evolve around this. And so that's what I'd share on this piece. And I have more to share on the relationship building later in the conversation.
Nicole, I'll hit this point with something that we have to just address, which is we have to ask ourselves why we're here and why is it structured this way. And, a little bit of, and this is just my opinion and how I've come to this conclusion, which is back in literally the 1600s, when the government in England had to make one of the first choices around what to do with people who were poor, right? They decided the first kind of laws that you saw in the mid 1500s, 1601, were laws that were rooted in who was worthy and unworthy of support. Yep. Before these laws, it had always been the church's responsibility, but somebody wanted to separate from the church, and so then the church couldn't tax people, so it boiled down to money. But when that happened, our social care system in the United States and the colonies, like those principles of who was deemed worthy, who was not deemed worthy, who would get which type of support became then. And so we've built these systems on this premise that there are some people who are unworthy. And that is why some folks feel like it's okay to terminate the rights of someone. Just because someone may not be able to be in your life to care for you off of a neglect issue does not mean that the relationship has to be severed and cut off. And even young people will tell you, no, it probably wasn't the best thing for me to live there, but it did not mean that I had to pretend like I no longer knew that person and that I had to erase every single thing that that person had contributed to my life.
Couldn't agree more with all these points. And I was really pleased in the last informational memo that the Children's Bureau issued in the beginning of the year, or the more recent one, I don't know if it's the last one, it really talked about that both and scenario about membership in the birth family and ongoing membership in the birth family seems to actually support and assist and promote better attachment to the adoptive family. And, historically, we have severed rights. You have to be clear. You can't see them if you're going to love them. It's like that either or thing that you talked about, Nicole. And how damaging that has ultimately been to folks. I used to teach this stuff before we all had cell phones and Facebook on it and whatever, right? So young people were finding their families without that. If you don't think that young people aren't making connections with the people that you're telling them they can't have connections with, then you're really missing the boat. And what you're doing is you're creating potential conflict about it. It's that thing that you mentioned, Nicole. If you don't love who I care about, then you don't love me, or I don't trust you. And that's the dynamic that gets created, and ultimately is one of the primary sources of disruption in adoptions. Is that we want to say you can't see your siblings, which is just I just think that's barbaric. I think the way we treat, ultimately, who do we know longest on the planet is our siblings. And if we aren't allowed to maintain love, care, trusting relationships and see them as frequently as possible, how do we actually develop love, care, and trust for others? I mean, it's a bigger challenge, and there's lots of resiliency, and as you say, Sixto, there's plenty of times people do all that kind of stuff, but why present that kind of a challenge? I just think that's one of our more barbaric practices that I think we rue now, and we got to fix. We can't just arbitrarily determine who you can have which sibling you can have a relationship with, or that you can't, if your mom's rights were terminated and your mom has other children, then you're not seeing your siblings. And it's just, right. Oh my God, it's awful.
As we're talking, I'm thinking about two other things too. In tribal communities, there's customary adoption, right? So there's this concept of you don't terminate the rights of a birth parent. You have other people who are family who can embrace young people in that way. I've often thought, I don't know why that concept and it's not in every tribal community, but it's in many tribes. Yeah. There's this concept of, you embrace another family who steps in addition to your family without severing connections. And then the other thing is, my beloved state of Louisiana has done a number of things good, but one of the things that they have is this whole law of reinstatement of parental rights. Yeah. So for instance, young people whose parental rights were terminated when they were 5 or 6, and now they're still in the system, can have their rights of the parents reinstated legally. Okay, a lot of times people will say it doesn't really matter if they were terminated, I'm still going to connect with them anyway. But there's a legal, entity to that. And again, another way of, I remember doing a training one time and talking about that, and the workers in Louisiana saying, I never heard of that. I'm like, well, you need to go back and talk to your supervisor about it. The supervisor said, I never heard of it either. And then when they talk to people, they realize, wow, this is a whole new area that we could have explored that people just weren't aware of. So, I mean, those are two things that pop up. I mean, I guess the other thing I wanted to ask you all is that, a lot of us who have been doing this a long time and people whose lives have been really deeply affected by this, I always say, well, what should people do? What are the things? There's no 5 tips or 10 tips or whatever, but I mean, what are things that actually work and forget permanence? Because I agree. I think it's a ridiculous word with respect to young people. Nobody knows what that means. I remember if I talk to young people and say, do you want permanence? They would say, well, I don't even know what that means. What do you mean? Yeah. It's about connections, right? It's about connectedness with people and multiple people, as you've all said, not just one person, and not necessarily just a legal connection, but a relationship and something that's emotional, and it might be legal. But what are things that workers should do to promote connectedness with young people who are in the child welfare system?
So I'd like to jump in on this real quick, just to build on I think the relationships with birth families. And actually, for me, this is the biggest area of child welfare. It's the most opportunity we have to grow. And I don't think we focus enough on the importance of maintaining birth and extended families relationships, even when adoption occurs. I think this is critical to the success, right? And youth, like I mentioned before, out of foster care, out of the gate, come as a blended family. So you have to get your mind around that. And I think the system does as well. But that's who's coming to and who we're recruiting, and how caseworkers are engaging from the very beginning. I think we often silo and we create those separations of working with the foster parent in that placement. And I've had the opportunity to work with several birth and foster parents and developing tools in this area for the field, because I saw it as a huge gap and many folks were working in this. And in some places it's called shared parenting or co-parenting. But again, there's so many principles to learn from that. And that should be a natural way that we're doing the work, not an afterthought. And it might look different based on different situations. But denying young people at any age the right to a relationship with family is wrong. It never really plays out well either. And I think we just have to address that this is a part of healthy relationship building for young people. And honestly, we have to look internally about what the bias and fears are that we hold as the agency or foster parents ourselves to that relationship. It's often not a safety concern. It's often fear of something else. And ultimately the child loses out from that system bias and from the fear of engaging with parents. And so I find that, young people have deep capacities to love multiple people. And we're limiting that by, kind of just thinking about their current placement. And so it often, again, creates those feelings of loss, anger, and rejection. And to me, I think this is something we have to care about. And so we've developed some tools. I can put them in the chat. But we brought together some birth parents and foster parents to actually think about this. And I remember our first meeting, birth parent was like, no way, that family's trying to take my child. And then we'd hear stories of foster parents saying, I'm actually doing this, but I'm fearful of the agency dinging me, or I'm having my license taken away. So I think we just have to evolve in totality around this, both how we recruit, how we think about who comes to be a placement for a child, and recognize that building these relationships are really critical to the healing practices, and they promote, those healthy relationships. So it's not going to be easy. It's not easy, but in terms of a first step is learning, constant learning, and also, what are the takeaways for those who have done this? We've heard some really beautiful stories of relationships between birth parents and foster parents, right, where the foster parent became maybe in a bind and they called on that birth parent. Right. Like, wow, transformation. And so that's an area that I think we have to just evolve on, and we have to do from the beginning.
Great. Sister, I know you wanted to speak as well.
Yeah, one of the things I think, the question was centered on the worker, and I have to also just take a step back and look at the actual system itself, because the thing that I also think that is so critical is that workers are working within a dynamic also where they could do so much to make this work, but then there are other pieces that I feel like have to be addressed at the systemic level. So for example, when I think about the licensing process, and so when a young person does identify someone, there was a state that took 16.5 months to be able to process someone. And when we were looking at, when one of our previous fellows was looking at the issue, what that fellow was able to find was that 30% of the failure points, the people who were failing, were because they didn't have a fire extinguisher. So we were like, well, carry a fire extinguisher in your actual car. But guess what? People's mental models were like, no, because then that's not how we should really test them. But we were like, why do you need to test someone if they have a fire extinguisher? Do you have a fire extinguisher in your house? When we think about the process and tools like Binti and Marina Martin's work around streamlining licensing and getting more kin families to be able to get licensed in less than 60 days in states like Washington now, there's a structural thing that has to be upgraded, right? And it has to do with a set of practices around how we actually think about evaluating people. The biggest barriers that are causing 2 to 3 months delays in these licensing process is because someone really has the mental model that we shouldn't give someone the checklist before we show up at their house, right? And so it's these type of tweaks that have been able to skyrocket different states to have 60% more increase in licensed homes, because they used a combination of these, what I call common sense practices, and on top of that, now adding software to the mix. So for me, when I start thinking about this, I'm thinking about what's the structure that the system is creating so that then it builds the confidence and trust of the young person. And I think this is important. If you want young people to start identifying people who are important to them in their life and that they would like to go deeper with, they have to have a level of confidence and trust in the system for them to be able then to say, yes, I'm willing to do this in partnership with you. Until that happens, there is no, in a systematic way, in my opinion, there is no dramatic boom of permanency skyrocketing through the roof, because the permanency that's happening right now, it's in spite of good, okay, bad practice. It's in spite of a system that's not actually designed to foster that connection. It's to go ahead and pipeline you to a placement that is permanent or semi-permanent.
And Gary, I think the linkage between both Sixto and Nicole's points are, how are we going to start? How are we going to first engage families when they're in their greatest need? And so there's lots of practices that have been developed, safety organized practice, signs of safety, all those sorts of things. There's other ones as well that want to assemble family from the very beginning, like who can get at your table in the next hour kind of thing, and to start to problem solve and to pull together the family's assets and resources. And it's not just the relatives, right? It's whoever the family considers to be family, and how to get that in place. And so if I'm in that family and I see somebody coming in and asking those questions to help the family solve the problems, I'm going to be much more trusting of that family and that organization, that they're interested in helping me keep my family together, than somebody that comes in, snatches me, puts me somewhere else, and says I can't talk to anybody, and then wants to find out who's that one person that I can go live with, but not interested in anybody else that I care about, like Nicole talked about. And so I think, and that's what the family finding laws are about, which, we have not done a great job of, now it's 12, 13 years since since that law was instituted. We still are not complying with it. We were still not finding within 30 days all the people that are loving connected. I'm talking about systemically, consistently in many, many districts, not there's individual circumstances, certainly, but we're not finding all the people that we're due. And when we do find them, again, back to Nicole's point, we're looking to them for placement, as opposed to building a network that would love, care, and support them, that may obviate the need for them to come into care. But if they do have to come into care, that they don't get isolated and lonely, and we're not damaging their DNA within weeks, which is one of the 21st century science pieces that we're finding, right? Is that the isolation and loneliness within weeks is starting to damage young people's DNA. And that lasts for a long time. So there's also some healing things that we're learning about too, along with the positive childhood experiences in the last couple of years of research, which I think is really promising. But from the start, we got to get families that are in charge and involved in making planning and decisions about their family members. And if we start there, I think we can at least partially, not entirely, but we can partially address disproportionality, disparity. It's a social justice issue for sure, and we aren't going to need to attract and recruit as many families to take care of other people's kids, because we're managing the assets within that family, and we're helping that family, bring those to bear and support them. So that, again, that could be another hour riff, but I'll hand it back to someone else.
I'm thinking as we're talking too, I'm a practitioner, so and have spent a lot of years in this field. So I'm always looking for what are the practical things that workers can do differently for young people. And we're fooling ourselves if we think that workers are not still saying to teenagers, you're too old to be adopted. You're too old for us to find a family. That happens still every day. In every state, I'm sure, regardless of all the fancy interventions we have, we still have workers who say those kinds of things to kids. And I think what I'm thinking is, as we're moving along, is what would have made a difference if in your own either practice or in your own life with respect to permanence. I'll answer first, because I think when I reflect back on kind of what I wish I did differently, I think I really wish I worked with families differently. I entered the field in 1976. Families were enemies. They were not partners. We didn't even have that word. We saw them as, people who couldn't take care of their children and whose children were taken away, and they probably didn't love their children. We know all that's wrong, but that's what I was introduced to in the world in the world of child welfare. But I regret that we didn't, and of course I changed my mind over time, but of course I worked with families differently over time. But I think we didn't do a good enough job of working with families to reunite them with their own young people, and I'm talking about older adolescents too, or to say, no, sorry, this is what all young people go through. The fact that they came in at 4:00 in the morning and you're saying that ain't happening in my house anymore, and they can't come back to live with me. It's like, wait a minute, how do we help you continue to love your child when they return home to you? And what kinds of things can we do practically to help you do that? So, I think from my perspective, that's how I'd answer that question. What would have made a difference? if I did a better job working with families, whether they were families we went out and found who would be able to be families for young people, or the birth families of young people. What do you think? What would have made a difference?
Yeah, for me, Gary, just to start out, because I started out in '79, so we're about the same period of time. I think the piece for me is better facilitating family solutions than deriving them. I think I was good at listening, but I was still in a position of, well, it's my job. I got to figure this out because that's how I was trained, right? And ultimately shifting into that role of better facilitating solutions rather than providing them and trying to convince people or not convince them, just do them, right? Because that's what, we had timelines, we had court reports to write, we had blah, 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 blah. And I think that it's that kind of shift is it's part of what we've been preaching for decades now. But if you go back to practice in the 80s and 90s, that was part of the deal. It was like it was rare you felt like you could amass the connection and the partnership so that you could turn it over, and you didn't feel safe as a worker doing that. And I think that's still very present in most child welfare offices, is that workers don't feel safe by handing over the reins to somebody else because they feel like they will get held responsible for the decisions families might make. I think that's part of the deal.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to package this into one answer. I feel like there's so many things. But I think there's an underlying theme. If you haven't heard it already, it's the humanizing of families. And honestly, when that doesn't happen, you're not benefiting anyone. You're not benefiting that parent. That parent loses hope. They potentially, if they have addiction, go further into their addiction, right? They're not seen as human. Then are we even really trying to serve the family? And I think we need to evolve from a child serving system to a family serving system, and recognize that, when we don't, that trusting relationship is also felt by the young person themselves. Oftentimes, and true for myself, young people they love their parents, and a lot of, 80% is neglect. And so they want the system and others who are, seemingly stepping in, and trying to do the right thing, to be a help. And often it's a hindrance, right? And it's often the subtraction of everything that child knows versus the building on. And I think if you haven't heard the theme, figuring out how to work more closely with parents and heal relationships is a necessary part of our work. And if you're not about that, then you're in the way. And you're doing practice, unfortunately, the way that's continuing to harm families and young people in care.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
When I think about everyone on the call, and I think about what is the one thing that you could do to make a difference and to be that difference, honestly, I think it's the framework of questioning everything and being curious. Because I think that when we are operating within a system that we inherited, that was based on the values of who was worthy and unworthy to get support, that was based on the values that there are some human beings that are less than others, right? The structural racism that we're here, keeping people of color out at one point. Like, there is so much here that innately we sometimes just start operating the way that we're being told to operate, that we become very complicit in the very things that we didn't sign up for. Right. And so for me, it's that curiosity in the questioning of everything. So if you're like, hey, someone told me we're not supposed to engage bio parents, but why? Could there potentially be an opportunity? Be curious beyond just the requirements. I'll tell you this quick story, and I'll end my last comment with this, which is, 2 years ago, I was in New York by accident, not by accident, I was in New York, and by chance, my sister calls me and she's like, hey, I know you're in town. I really don't want to do this. I really didn't want to go. And I didn't really want to tell you, but there's a family reunion today. And I was just like, okay, I'm going. And so it was on my father's side, which I didn't have a lot of connection. So then what ended up happening is that we go to this barbecue. It's my father's side of the family. And it's like, you know, what I think what most young people in foster care dream of is like, there's more family, people who are like, holy crap, you know, want to be connected. But then something really distracted me from being able to process the moment, which is like, I saw a Mexican sibling set of running around. I saw a white sibling set running around. And I'm like, who are these kids? Because they don't look like us, right? And we Puerto Ricans, we come in all shapes and sizes, but it was clear that, you know, there was a difference here. And everybody would just say little cousins, little cousins, little cousins. And come to find out, at that family reunion in New York, 5 of my uncles and aunts were foster adoptive parents for over 35 years. That's older than me. And so it was the lack of curiosity, the lack of questioning that never got to reveal that information. We were always 2 questions away from figuring out that piece. And so missing out in what feels like almost like a lifetime of connections, because, you know, the way that we have inherited the system and the way we've been trained to operate in it was that at that time, we didn't ask about the father side as much. We didn't ask, you know, when I said the question was, who do you want to live with? Do you have a family member that can take you in right now? I didn't even know that there were other family members who could have done that. And the fact that so many of my aunts and uncles have actually adopted sibling sets, right? And that was their thing. So to me, that's the opportunity.
Thanks, Cisco, for sharing that, and thank you all. I've been sharing this with my class. I've been watching the show, and I know I'm behind the times here. But Orange is the New Black, and it's this incredible show about people who are incarcerated. But the reason that the majority of them are incarcerated is because they had family drama, severe issues. Many of them grew up in foster care. And I just keep, every time I watch it, I keep thinking, my gosh, there's a backstory that everybody has that a lot of times when we're so engaged in the system, we're not even thinking about, right? And I think all of our families and everybody we work with, and ourselves included, all have this backstory, right? That you know needs to get unpacked at some point in time, and I think that you know that's part of our job, and part of the challenge of what we're doing is how do you help people unpack that and then you know move forward. So you know when we're thinking about permanency for young people and connectedness for young people, is what are the circumstances, you know, not what happened, you know, kind of what caused you to be at this point in your life, right? You know, and what caused, you know, with all the trauma that young people have experienced just in being in the foster care system alone, just the moment you enter the system, there's trauma. Is you know, what could we have done differently, and what could we continue to do differently? And I think it's our challenge for people who are listening and participating as well, is, you know, how do we reflect on moving forward? What could we do differently? I think, Selena, unless I'm mistaken, are we at the point where we're going to open this up for questions?
Yeah, I think we actually got through a lot right now, and I think you all addressed a lot of the questions that came up from the attendees and the participants ahead of time. So I think we covered a lot of that, so we can wrap up. So if there are any closing thoughts, please share any closing thoughts. If not, we'll get ready to wrap up.
All right, so why don't we start there? And Bob and Cisco and Nicole, and thank you so much for being part of this. Just some maybe closing thoughts that you'd like to share with folks before we end.
It's a pleasure to be asked and to join this fabulous panel. I really appreciate the opportunity. The piece that I think about here is a lot of Bruce Perry's work that, you know, obviously getting a lot of attention right now, and that healing is in loving relationships. It's not in somebody's therapy office. It doesn't mean that therapy can't be helpful to support healing, but the healing actually occurs biologically, physically, in loving and caring relationships. And I think that so therefore we have to stop dissolving them, and we have to make sure that we invest in them and ensure the access to them so that people can heal. That's the evidence base, by the way.
It is.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bob.
Yeah.
I was going to say something similar in that, thank you for what you do. Thank you for having this important panel. Challenge you to think about what you could potentially take from this panel and do differently. And really think about the importance of the healing and the connections beyond a legal permanency standpoint. But there's something, you can think about doing every day. I liked Sixto's charge about curiosity. I think understanding the reasons that, are behind things or holding things in place and getting behind those biases and mental models helps us get to better conclusions. And so a focus on healing and exploration continues to drive towards where we need to be and evolve on the topic of permanency and keeping young people connected to their families.
Thank you, Nicole.
And I guess I started off my call of action too early, but I'll leave you with that one and just say thank you to everyone who showed up, and thank you for being part of this. It was so great to be here and to be such among the panels of people who I love and adore and have been following your work for a long time.
Thank you all. It's been a real honor and pleasure to work with you, and I hope that this was really helpful to people who joined us today. So thanks so much to Darlene and to Selena for inviting us all to be part of this, and look forward to continued conversations.
Yes, and thank you all so much for joining us, Gary, for facilitating the conversation and for sharing your insights, and Nicole and Sixto and Bob for sharing your wisdom, your personal experiences, your professional experiences so vulnerably and honestly. I know you really sharing has given so much perspective, and the resources you shared are also going to be very impactful. So we are greatly, greatly appreciative for all of you for joining us today. And to our participants and our attendees, thank you all so much for taking an hour out of your day for this important conversation. And we're so grateful for you to be joining us. And there is a link in the chat to upcoming events. So we hope you can join us for any upcoming events, and we will follow up with additional resources from our panelists. So thank you all so much and have a great day.
Thanks for your support, Selena.
Yes, thank you, Selena.
Yes, bye everyone.